Learn the most empowering hiring techniques. Land the most desirable talent. Launch your company towards massive success. This is the Higher Power Radio Show with your host, Rick Gerard.
All right, now every company must continually communicate with their team if they are on or off the bus, seeking to understand if they are the strongest person in the right seat. Now, having worked with some of the most outstanding founders over the past few years, the one thing I've learned is that this conversation should happen often and always be welcome. Surprise resignations should never happen. They should be planned, celebrated, and fully supported. I'm Rick Gerard, and welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show. We help entrepreneurs and executives win the strongest people. We do so by sharing insights from top performing rebel entrepreneurs, game changers, and industry leaders like our guest today, Mr. Randy Wooten. Now, Randy is the CEO of Maxo. He's a three-time CEO who has sat on the board of several other VC and PE-backed companies. Most recently, he was tapped by Battery Ventures to step in and take over the integration of SAS Optics and Chargeify, which they purchased in 2021. He and his team launched a new brand, Maxo, and they've been hard at work at rebuilding out new capabilities to support Maxio's vision and to help startups accelerate their growth. With more than 2,200 customers, Maxo is the industry's leading billing and financial operations platform for B2B SaaS companies, which is what makes Randy the perfect expert for today's topic. Randy, welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show today.
Thanks, Rick. You nailed it.
Thank you. Yeah, I always have like 2 or 3 flubs when I'm introducing people, but hey, it's part of my charm.
You got it. Yeah, I know the essential is done, and yeah, Maxo, you nailed it. Billing and invoicing, rev rec reporting for B2B SaaS companies, and so we focus on those early stage founders who are trying to figure out, they got a great product. How do they get product market fit, and then how do they get paid for it and collect the cash, and then over time, how do they get funded and stay funded? So we're squarely in that early stage, enabling the innovators to unlock their next stage of growth.
Which is funny because that's kind of the reason why I reach out to you personally on my end too, because I'm there, and you and I will be having some offline conversations.
Look forward to it.
I know. All right, well, very cool. So, one of the things that you're an expert in is actually coming in at that phase when the founders get some product market fit, they start growing, and then, the companies start thinking about like, how do we scale, right? And I think I said to you offline, like, some people probably review you as a threat, but I'm guessing, like, for me, it's like, you're like the next phase of the company, right? Getting us to a growth phase, right? So let's talk a little bit about like how you're brought in and kind of what your expertise is and how that kind of translates through to solving the problem that most companies have.
Right. So first, I'd say I'm not an expert. I've had a couple of tours of duty, which we'll talk about, in the specific inflection point where companies are moving from, call it Series A, Series B. They've got product market fit. They've started to build out a sales team. They're starting to think of things about customer success. They're starting to think about how do we scale? How do we do efficient growth, not just growth at all costs? And so what I bring to the table is some experience having worked at large companies like Microsoft and Salesforce, where you see how do you orchestrate across thousands of people. I've worked at small companies. I've worked at, as I mentioned, I've been on a couple of boards. I've done due diligence for PE firms. So I feel like where my strong suit is in this, how do you set up a company's operating system? How do you set up an executive team to scale to that next level? And we'll get into some of the specifics there. But I do think there are these inflection points. So getting to $1 million, there's an inflection point ARR. There's an inflection point at $10 million ARR. And then I think you kind of get into this valley of death somewhere between $20 million and $40 million, where if you're not able to scale, you're just going to turn into a zombie company. But if you can scale and drive efficiency and get the flywheel going, then you can start to track towards that next inflection point, which is 100 mil. So I'm kind of brought in by VCs or PE where they feel that often its growth has stalled. They're not 100% sure if it's a market problem. Is it a marketing problem? Is it a sales execution problem? Is it a customer success problem? So I'm primarily a go-to-market guy who comes in and helps assess what's happening, comes in with some playbooks, has some speed dials to people who are much more intelligent than I am about specific issues, and then we get at it.
So, and it's funny because you're brought in to figure out what's not working, and usually, like, it's funny because I say this a lot, and you're going to probably argue with me. Most business problems are people problems in disguise, right? I mean, that's really, wrong person on the bus, and what got you here won't get you there. There's a lot of like those scenarios that come into play, right? So, what what I seen this. I get brought in as a recruiter to kind of bring you to find you to come in to fill that role, right? So, um, now that I'm in a software company, not so much anymore. But like there's certainly a this is like you said, the valley of deaths like happen at these different growth phases, and now like when you come in, you get brought in, what do you do? Like what you identify those problems, then how do you attack, like what are the most likely problems that you find, um and then we'll talk about how you tackle it.
Yeah, so I think a couple things. One is if you're I would call them often like I'm a scale up CEO or a professional CEO. I've never been smart enough to be a founder. And so I come in with a different skill
I
set
don't
than
think you
what
have
I've
to be smart, you just have to be crazy enough to be a
too
founder.
crazy and bold. And I think a high risk
Yeah,
tolerance, right? Like you got to
yeah,
be okay with people saying no, 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 no. At the time that I'm coming in, is enough people have said yes that it's a different skills that you're moving forward. And so I think that it starts early in the recruiting process. So someone like you reaches out and says, "Hey, there's a company that's backed by this sponsor, VC or PE. They seem to be having some challenges. Does this align with your background and experience?" And we'll talk a little bit. And then from that moment, when you start talking to the board, because that's usually who you're interviewing with, you've got
yeah,
your spidey sense up, and you're trying to figure out what they think is wrong and articulate it in terms of strategy and execution. Is it a segment problem? Is it a monetization problem? And so you just got to absorb all this information. And that probably happens the first 60 days of your engagement before you even talk to the company. As part of that, you sign an NDA, you try to get as much information as you can, like board decks, financial information. So I go in and do forensics and look for gross retention, net retention by segment, by product, by region, get deep into the sales cycle in terms of win rates, conversion rates, all of that, pipeline health, all of that, to start to really look at it. Because sometimes I think the VC people in particular, they have a sense something is not working. They're not seeing the bookings growth, but they're not double clicking down into, well, what really is the issue? So boom, now you're in the company. And I think you have a 90-day sort of first phase zero, where you're listening, you're pattern matching, and you're trying to assess. You're assessing the talent. So to your point, are the individuals we have in the executive team people who've seen this movie before? Is this the first time at the seat around the table? How much development are they going to need to be able to scale into what Lencioni talks about as that first team? Where, if you're struggling, where are you going to double down? You can't replace the whole executive team. And your hope as a professional CEO, look, some people think of me as a grim reaper, but my goal is to come in and try to set up the company for success. And so I do not want to take out the executive team.
yeah,
However, I need to figure out who's going to be able to scale to the next stage. So if we're at 40 million, can scale to 100 million, and with what type of coaching. So I think that
yeah,
first 90 days, you're assessing the functions, you're assessing the people, you're assessing the broader strategy, and then you need to come back to the board and say, "Hey, when I started, I had a 90-day plan. I had some hypotheses. These are what I've learned over the next 90 days, and from this, here's going to be my priorities moving forward." And I think you find it breaks down into really kind of three problems: go to market, scaling, so systems, process, and then leadership. And I think leadership is often, early stage companies in technology are founded by technical folks who sometimes just don't want to manage, or they don't like the complexity. They don't like all the people issues. So some of it is just about, they need someone who can come in and be more of an externally facing CEO to raise money and to manage the team and put up with all the management issues. And they may prefer to be CTO or chief strategy officer. So figuring out what seat on the bus people can play for today and tomorrow is one of the key responsibilities of when you fleet up as a professional CEO.
yeah. That's so important, having that, like going in and understanding, like we work with a lot of EOS companies, right? And like they talk about GWC, which is get it, want it, and have the capacity to
Yeah,
do it, right? So
perfect.
like evaluating people when you come in, but also you also, that takes you a step further into like if you do have to move somebody out because they're not on the right seat on the bus, right? Maybe to a different seat. Now you've got to make sure that you get somebody in there that actually does fill that seat, right?
And I think that every company I've been at, it feels like you got to find. It's unfortunate. You got to find one executive who isn't pulling their weight and pull the trigger on them in the first 30 or 60 days, and
Yeah.
that sends a message to the entire organization that there's a new sheriff in town. And as part of that, you're able to establish new expectations in terms of both the what they do and the how they do it. And so the what they do, we'll get into a little bit in terms of objectives and key results and V2 Mom. The how is something that I spent a lot of time with in leadership development. I was on the bench program at Microsoft, the bench program at Salesforce. I went to the Naval Academy. I've read 100 leadership books. Like, developing leaders is one of the I wouldn't call strong suits, but one of the areas I really focus on. What does it mean to be a leader versus what does it mean to be a director versus what does it mean to be a manager? Early stage startups may not draw that distinction, and they are very different. Managers
Early
are focused.
stage startups, it's just, you want that title? Great, go
Yeah,
for
right,
it.
totally.
Yeah,
But when you
yeah,
think
it's
about, you get to
Wild
50
West.
mil, like, you need your executive team. I talk about people in their altitude. They need to be thinking about and worrying about things that are going to be true in the next 18 to 24 months.
Yeah,
If you as a CEO are focusing on issues that need to, that are being addressed this week or this month, you're over functioning and you're disempowering your leadership team. But you got to set the expectations in terms of how do you create a rhythm of the business such that you're creating visibility and transparency so that as that executive team, we're executing against our 90-day plan. So you can spend time talking about the next act and doing the hard work around the strategic decisions that need to be made. So getting that altitude right and understanding how to that's part of the scaling process. Who do you have at what stage and sort of what level within an org without creating a lot of hierarchy? You got to have some mechanism for span of control. It can't be 1 to 100.
yeah. All right, so I want to get into this. So you're listening to the Higher Power Radio Show. I'm your host, Rick Gerard. And for our podcast listeners, we're going to take a quick educational moment from our sponsors. All right, I'm digging in deep with our guest, Randy Wooten. He is the CEO of Maxo, and we're talking about how to understand if your people are on or off the bus. And now we're going to get into this framework you talked about, you kind of teased out, which is kind of the company operating system, right? So V2 Mom, I think, is what we talked about offline. What is V2 Mom first?
Well, I stole it, right? I don't ever have any good ideas. I just steal other people's idea and replay them into a new context. The broad construct of V2 Mom is Mark Benioff, and you can read about it in Behind the Cloud. He has a very specific definition for each of those. What I liked about it was it's memorable, right? It's each of the letters means something. I've taken it and adjusted it for and adapted it for what I call the startup, at the speed of startups. So for me, V2 Mom, the whatever it is, 5 things are vision, values, mission, objectives, and metrics. And to break that down, vision is your to be state. It's where are you going? Why do you exist? And a lot of people kind of poo poo that and think it's still wordy. I do think there's real value. Like, for example, with
I do
Maxo,
too.
we had 2 companies come together who had very different visions, creating one vision about what are we trying to do. So at Maxo, we're trying to help innovators unlock their next stage of growth. That orients us around everything that we're trying to do. But it's too high level for the individual developer or individual salesperson to feel like, oh yeah, today I helped an innovator unlock their next stage of growth. So then you move into, I'm going to go to M before the next
But hold
B.
on, the vision though, let me just add some. Like, it is a very powerful tool in getting people to buy in too. Like, and you're right. I've seen people poo-poo vision.
Yeah.
It does mean something. And if
Oh,
people understand where you're going with the company, then you're going to get a higher quality of person that's going to want to join the company rather than, hey, we're building this widget and we hope it works out. I mean, who's that going
yeah,
to,
Rick.
right?
I'm. What is it? I'm. Lots of years of trying to do this at multiple companies and
Yeah.
dealing with the resistance of, oh God, we're going to do another vision exercise. But I would say one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about is building connections and community, especially in a hybrid environment
Yeah.
and culture, right? That manifests in culture. And what you in all the research, people want to be able to feel connected to the purpose of the organization. They want to feel connected to the leadership team, and they want to be connected to their peers. So when you have vision and mission, That helps people understand how they're connected, especially in a hybrid environment. So don't get me wrong. I think having vision,
No,
having it clearly articulated is it's the why behind everything. What I think you
I
then need
couldn't
to
agree more. Couldn't agree more, my friend.
So
All
then
right,
what you need
so
to do, so then what
yeah,
I do is I have a definition. Hey, I came from the military. For me, missions are about things you go out and you try to accomplish. I used to fly in A6 intruders, went to the Persian Gulf a couple of times. You flew a mission, successful mission, you came back, you landed the aircraft. For me, a mission is what are you trying to achieve over the next 18 months? And that becomes now the North Star. You have a metric associated with it, one metric that's determining are you going to be successful. So for us, our mission right now is to increase gross retention to X percentage, and we're a little bit below that, but we're making traction against that. That guides what our CS team does. It guides our prioritization of product capabilities. It guides what our RevOps teams does. So having a mission, an 18-month mission. So that's having those two things together, Rick, I think speaks to your point of people being motivated. They join a company for an
yeah,
idea and a promise, right? That's what you got to nail.
for sure.
So then another part of that, I think it's more subtle, and we can dig into this, is values. I think values are another one of those kind of can be a Dilbert exercise. We've all been at companies where the values are posted on the wall and people don't know what they are, can't remember them, and it's not really affecting who they are and how they interact. And I think we can dig a little bit into that if you want, but I think there are a couple of HBR articles I put in the show notes that people can share. And I think what happens is people, when they are doing values, conflate two things. One is values. There are expressed values today in your company. It's the way people interact with each other, how they treat
Yeah,
each other, how they show up in meetings, their commitment to being on time, their commitment to doing work. Like all of that is behaviors that are rooted in a set of values that are rewarded and recognized by the system. You
yep.
can have some accidental values that just kind of develop because of how the culture developed. What often happens is people come in, like me, say, hey, we need to reset our values. And you set up these aspirational values of what you want to be like without recognizing and appreciating what the core values are. So, one example, Mark Benioff, I think, was just led with great values in his whole Ohana thing and what it meant to be part of the family. Like we lived
Yeah,
those values, and it was radically different than some other software companies that I had been in previously. When
yeah,
Satya Nadella took over Microsoft, he introduced a whole new set of aspirational values. And my friends who have been there for 20 years say he changed the culture radically in less than 4 years. It was with and he had been an internal Microsoft candidate, right? But he was able to shift the company. And I would say, Microsoft, look at the stock price when Ballmer was there versus what Satya has done. And
yeah.
people will tell you it was tied to values. So I think getting your values right, we can dig in on that more.
No, you know what? I got to agree with you. But you know what? You mentioned like what the case study that you just kind of gave, right? Is that those values came from the leader, right? They come
Yeah.
from you, they
Yeah.
come from me.
Yeah.
And it's our behaviors that drive those things that people are going to either resonate with and hey, this is a behavior that I can buy into or not. And then, and if they don't, then they move on. And that's a good thing for the business,
Right.
right?
And I
But
think you're right. I think it has to be a CEO sponsored thing. It can't be an
for
outsourced
sure.
delegated to the HR. I don't know, like my values, our values. So one of the things you'll hear is, to make values work, they got to be memorable. And so like having an acronym really helps. Ours is
Yeah.
HYPE, and HYPE is for honest and open. It's your input matters, passion for projects, and expect excellence. So super easy to remember,
Yeah.
good values that other companies could have, but it's also a fun word like, hey, are you hyped? And you can use it in all hands. You can use it in like we use systems like Bonusly to reinforce it. But I am passionate about those ideas of being open and honest.
Yeah.
Truth is on the front lines. I'm going to do one-on-ones, skip levels, and go around and meet people. I want to hear them and have their input. I have a relentless focus on progress that we're going to evolve and get better. I want to be world class. I want to get an A in everything. And so maybe there's a little bit of overlap with expect excellence there, but we always talk about benchmarks. How are we stacking against benchmarks, and show me what it means to be best? So all of those are really consistent with who I am as a person. There's some other values that I have that aren't articulated in the core company values. So I do think it's this balance of CEO has to sponsor it, CEO has to articulate it and live them, but it has to be unified broadly with what's happening in the company. So I could have these values, and I think sometimes that's where CEOs fail. They come in with this orientation. Like, gosh, I was just listening to a great story on NPR today about Nike, and Nike is blowing up. Well, guess what happened? They hired a new CEO in like 2020, and he came in with a different set of values, and he wanted to move everything to digital, and it just blew up. So now they're going back to a new CEO who had been a longtime Nike person
Oh, it
and
blew up
moved.
bad.
Blew up bad, horrible.
Oh, okay,
Nike,
got
I
it.
mean, just
I
crushed.
thought
Like
you
they, oh
I
yeah,
thought you
so it
meant
was
like it
wrong.
blew up like it
No,
was
no.
great.
No,
Oh,
no. Now,
okay.
my point is, like, you had a mismatch between what he was focused on was distribution. How could he sell more shoes online? And we gave up on what his value. Clearly, I don't know the dude. I mean, he's probably wicked smart and
Yeah.
run circles around me. But what the core insight was, what he gave up was the value of innovation. And one of the things that Nike had done for years was been in front with the new innovation, not just sending out the new Air Force One and all the different recycling of the brands, but doing the cool new stuff. And so
Yeah.
that was a value that Nike was known for. It got lost in this new world, which was drive distribution innovation. And so, anywho, I think you got to have a CEO match with where the current context is and where you want to go.
That is so very true. And you bring up a really good point. These aspirational values, I see this a lot with startups that we work with where you mentioned Patrick Lucioni. He's got this book and Be Humble, Be Kind, Be Smart. I forgot which book it was, but so I was working with a company not too long ago where they pulled that out as those were their core values. And it became very apparent within probably 20 minutes of the conversation with everybody that humble was not present
Right.
in that company. There was nobody that was humble.
Right.
And it was really interesting how, and I had to kind of have this argument with him about the fact that, like, hey, look at your core values need to be real. Otherwise, people are just going to roll their eyes and they're not going to buy into them.
And in fact, I think there's another great book. So I love Lencioni. One of his books is The Five Dysfunction of the Team. And that ties in with that. That also has that whole idea, how do you create the first team? The other book I love is by Stephen Covey's, I think it's his son. It's called The Speed of Trust. And the
Okay.
speed of trust, when you're building trusting relationships in organizations. Look, I tell everyone, like, software is a people business, right? And what does people business come down to? It's building relationships. How do you build a relationship? You establish trust and confidence. Trust that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. You're operate with integrity. You're going to tell the truth. Confidence that we've hired you to do this job and you can go do it. And I think this idea of values being rooted in that, you erode trust if you have cognitive dissonance and heart dissonance with the values. You say one thing, but you're living and demonstrating a different thing.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. It's funny because I always get really skeptical when I come into a company and I see their values are integrity, teamwork, passion,
Yeah.
honesty. And I always kind of laugh. I always make the joke that who else's number one core value is integrity? Enron. So
Yeah. And that's what that article I shared has, that exact same thing. And I think,
oh,
look, there, what do they call it? There's kind of like basic values, like you expect people to tell the truth. Like that's not going to be one of your differentiators, right? Like integrity.
yeah, but there are CEOs that don't tell the truth. So I mean,
Yeah, that's true.
I mean,
Yeah.
there are very highly functioning companies out there that operate outside of what everybody says is what should be a functioning team, right? I mean, like you can look at Wall Street in
Correct.
general. I mean, they're all, you can judge however you want, but they are highly functioning businesses that do really, really well. But if you put somebody who truly has integrity and honesty into
Yeah.
those companies, that's why they fail, right? Like, because they don't really integrate into like who they really are.
Rick, you're probably right. What I would say, and I would just fall back on, I went to the Naval Academy. I spent 8 years in the Navy. Not that I'm
Sure.
perfect, but the idea of character and
Yeah.
integrity is like a starting point. Like, you don't pass go if you don't have that. And we fire people if they lie, and people can argue that. But just every person that I know, I've been out for a while, but the admirals that are still in that I went to school with are extraordinary humans with incredible character, integrity. They're going to tell the truth and going to try to do the right thing. They may not get it right, but they're going to try to do the right thing. And it just gives me incredible confidence that we're going to have smart people evaluating crazy, chaotic situations. I would suggest in the corporate world, you have less emphasis on that because people come through, they go through regular colleges. It's not, character and integrity is not as reinforced. They go into a career profession and may not be reinforced. They've never had to be held accountable for it. And so it's like, that's a starting point for me. And if you don't believe in that, well, then you can find another company to work for.
Totally. All right. So let's talk about the last part of MOM, right?
Yeah.
So we have objectives and metrics.
Yeah. And so this is where you start to translate the vision and the mission into specific objectives, things that need to be accomplished. I stole that from John Doerr and his old OKR construct.
You could just say it's yours. I'm okay with that.
Okay. Well, I just want to give credit where it's due.
I'm kidding. Everything's borrowed these days.
Oh,
anyway,
yeah. I mean,
right?
it all goes back to Drucker. Like if you read Drucker, like I bought all my my executive team his book, The Essential Executive, and gave it to him the other week. And I was like, I've been writing all this stuff about the 8 secrets of success for CEOs. And I reread Drucker. I was like, all I'm doing is reworking Drucker. But MBOs and then KPIs, all of that. So anyway, the Uber point is you want to have a set of objectives that are meaningful for the company and specific enough that they guide actions so that they help people make trade-offs.
Yeah.
So those are the objectives. The metrics are how are you going to measure success? And you can break those down into leading and lagging metrics. You always want to have targets. Those targets can either be based on historical trends or they can be based on external validation, like win rates, for example. And then you use that I call it a plan on the page, 90-day plan on the page. What are the key results you're driving, and a scorecard? What are the objectives and the metrics that you're measuring, and how are you doing on some metrics are weekly metrics, some metrics are monthly metrics, some metrics are quarterly metrics, and that becomes part of a rhythm of a business. So you have a company operating system and you have a rhythm of the business to bring accountability and visibility to what's working and what's not.
Yeah. And I think most systems have those, and I think most of us do pretty well with those things, right? But tying those to the mission, vision, and values, to me, the values are the thing that drive the vision and the mission, right? Like so, and again, often you get two kind of sides of the same coin, where like people are like, oh, it's all bullshit. And then you get some people who are like, man, we've been doing it for 3 years. It's made a huge difference in my business. It's like a born again core values person, right? Like it's crazy.
I think two things. One is it comes down to how you execute. So I do think there are people who, embrace these things at different levels of accountability. We turn the V2 MOM, right? It's a super simple construct. We turn it into a one-pager. That one-pager is something we share regularly, and the scorecard we review every single month. So every single month are talking about the objectives and the metrics. We highlight what's working, what's not. We take it another level. Every functional expert, every functional leader needs to write an operating plan where they take the corporate objectives and they translate it into what needs to be true for them this year. And I think that construct of having that hard work being done by the executive with their VPs, and it's like, okay, we need to secure and expand our customer base. Well, what are we going to do about that in engineering? What are we going to do about that in marketing? What can we do about that in finance? And so having those conversations in November, December really then lead to a set of trade-offs and priorities and funding decisions. And then the executive team has to work through that. And you lock that down and you say, okay, everybody, this is our plan for the year. And if it just sits on the bookshelf or sits in the GDoc drive for a year, it's a waste. But that's the CEO and the executive team's responsibilities. How do you bring that back? How do you have people live it? How does it inform the decisions you're making each and every day?
Perfect. All right, Randy, we're getting pretty close on time. What would be 2 or 3 key takeaways you can give the audience that they can plug into their business today?
Well, I think what we've been talking about, if you don't have some sort of company operating system, and there are a bunch of them out there, is find one. I would say find a coach. If you're an early stage founder, I always recommend people having a mentor and a coach. A mentor is someone who's been in the same situation that you've been in, so stage, size, context. A coach is someone who helps you on the interpersonal effectiveness. How do you get better at managing your board? How do you get better at managing your leadership team? How do you get better at building out a management cadre? So company operating system, find a mentor / coach. Third thing I would say is, look, I highly recommend early stage CEOs joining a group like EO or YPO or something along those lines. Being a CEO is a lonely job.
For sure.
Everybody blames you, right? And you blame yourself. And so I think getting into an environment where you can share what you're afraid of, what's working, what's not, and you don't have to feel like you have all the answers, it can be a really positive experience. I've had peer groups at every company I've been at, and it's provided a great forum for convincing, but also some good validation and just problem solving.
Amen. Amen. Randy, thanks so much for your time investment today. And I want to welcome you to the Higher Power Radio community. Now, what would be the best way in which members of the audience could find you, find your company?
Well, LinkedIn is where I'm doing all my posting and where I have the 8 secrets of success for CEOs. Would love for people to read that. They can also find, I'm doing blog. So all the cool kids have got a podcast. I've got that going too. It's called SaaS Expert Voices. You can sign up for it either through Apple or through our website. I'm happy to spend 15, 20 minutes with anybody who wanted to reach out to me at randy.wooten, WOOTTON at maxio.com. Always love talking to people, hearing about what's working, what's not, and learning through that process as well.
Perfect. All right. Well, I want to thank you for tuning in this week's episode of Higher Power Radio. Quick thanks to our team, Brian Colburn, Andrea Ballin, and Ayla Gerard. If you're listening to the podcast, please subscribe, review, and share. After all this show's for you, we want to continue to bring you great content week after week. You can join the Higher Power Radio community at Higher, H-I-R-E, Power, P-O-W-E-R, radio, R-A-D-I-O.com, or you drop me an email at rick@intertrue.ai. I'm your host, Rick Gerard, and you have been listening to the Higher Power Radio Show. Aloha.
Thank you for listening to Higher Power Radio. Catch our LinkedIn Live show every Tuesday at noon, or download the podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. We appreciate you joining us on Higher Power Radio with your guide to hiring success, Rick Gerard.